Okay, so hello everyone and welcome back to another nQuery webinar where this month the topic is predicting how long your trial will take, a practical guide to milestone prediction. So I'll be discussing enrollment and survival event milestone predictions and demonstrating how these predictions can be made via simulations in our nQuery prediction module. As usual, I want to thank everyone for registering for this session, and hopefully you'll find this topic interesting. Before I get started, I'll just deal with a few frequently asked questions. So to start, this webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording and the slides will be sent to you shortly after the session is finished, hopefully within 24 hours. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, let us know in the chat and we'll do our best to help out. And then finally, if you can also use the chat function for any questions relating to the content, and then they'll be answered either at the end if there's time, or else we'll respond by email after the session is finished. So just to introduce myself, my name is Paul Murphy. I'm an nQuery research statistician here at StatSalts, working mainly on table development across all areas of the software, and I'll be your host for today. So just to give you a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about. So I'll begin with some background about clinical trial milestones and factors that affect how long it'll take to conduct your trial. Then specifically, I'll go into more detail on enrollment milestones for almost all studies and event milestones for survival studies. Next, I'll use a worked example to give a detailed demonstration of how you can perform a milestone prediction in nQuery. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some concluding remarks. Throughout this webinar, I'll be demonstrating the main concepts with worked examples, and these calculations will be conducted using nQuery, the complete solution for optimizing your clinical trial designs. Here at nQuery, we have many solutions for fixed-term, Bayesian, and adaptive designs. So from preclinical through to early phase, confirmatory, and then on to post-marketing. And as you'll see today, we also have a prediction tool for enrollment and event milestones, which is done via simulation. nQuery is a very well-established and widely used software. It's been around for over 25 years and has more than 50,000 users in over 100 countries. And just a couple of years ago, almost 90% of organizations with clinical trials approved by the FDA had an nQuery license of some sort. And just note that the example today will come from nQuery Predict, which is our expert tier. So if you're not familiar with the software, or if your license currently doesn't allow you access to this tier, then you can easily start a free trial without any install required, and there'll be more information about that at the end. Okay, so the purpose of this webinar will be to help you get a better understanding of when your trial is going to finish. And to really understand this, you're going to want to have an estimate of when certain study milestones will occur. When designing a clinical trial, clearly you have a lot to consider, like what model you're going to use, how many groups there'll be, what your acceptable type 1 error will be, and if you want to make any adaptations at a planned interim analysis. Typically, when you're designing a trial, one of the biggest considerations is the sample size calculation, which this is where nQuery traditionally focuses. So like determining how many people you need in your study to satisfy a specific criteria of success. say like 80 or 90% power. So there'll be certain key milestones based on our trial design, like the sample size, that need to be reached before we can end the trial or do an interim analysis. These milestones will generally be related to the enrollment, like how long it'll take to recruit the required sample size. And then in practical terms, you'd often add on a fixed time to this enrollment period as like the time taken to administer the treatment or the intervention to patients. In addition to this, in the case of a survival study, the power is going to be driven by the events process. So we'll need to observe a certain number of events before the study can end or before we can do an interim analysis. So here we need to consider both the enrollment and the survival processes, as well as other things like dropout or cures, basically anything that can prevent a subject from having the event. Delays in clinical trials are very common. It's often reported that around 80% of clinical trials are delayed and that about 85% actually never reach their recruitment goal. So what we want to do today is look at the more practical side of things, like how are you getting these people into your study? Can we predict before the trial starts how long it's going to take? And then if things do start to go wrong, can we identify this as soon as possible and then take some action? So, like if your accrual wasn't going as quickly as planned, then you could open new sites, you could look at closing inefficient ones, and basically you'll be able to identify where any additional resources should be allocated if they become available. But in order to evaluate how your trial is going so far, we need something to compare it to. And that's when predictions come into use, both before and during the trial. So what are some elements that we need to consider if we want to do a milestone prediction? Well, first of all, let's identify our primary and secondary milestones. Today, and in general, really, our primary milestones will be enrollment in almost all studies, and then also events in the case of a survival study. So like what we want to predict is when will the study end or when can we conduct an interim analysis? And then we might also have some secondary considerations. These could be like safety benchmarks, some specific sponsor requests, or if there's anything that's of specific interest to the regulator. Another important thing to think about is what information will be available and who is actually going to be doing the prediction. Like, does the prediction have to be done by someone senior, or maybe would it be better to be done by someone external to the trial where there's less interference and they might have access to more information? Like, in reality, a lot of the time, the trials themselves won't have access to all of the information. Like, it's pretty unlikely that they'll be able to see the unblinded data with the treatment labels. So instead, they might have to assume an overall global event process instead of modeling each treatment arm separately. Or maybe they could look to apply a more complex methodology, which would try to like extract the per group survival rates from the blinded data. So then you'd have a decision to make about what is the most appropriate way to model the events for your prediction. Similarly, if you have access to the site level data, then a further like degree of flexibility is opened up to you. But if you can only see subject level data, again, you're going to be a little bit more limited. And then finally, just one more point before I move on. There's the very kind of common question of how often should these predictions be made. And you might be tempted to use all of the data like as it comes in and then regularly update your predictions. But there is an argument that this could sort of disturb the natural rhythm of your trial, and that maybe you should wait for a more general pattern to develop before deciding if changes need to be made. Like sometimes, like often you see that you just happen to have slower recruitment in the beginning of the trial as things start to get going. So you wouldn't want to overreact by opening too many sites, and then you could end up wasting resources or overwhelming some support staff. Then specifically for survival studies and event milestones, we need to be aware of other complications, such as, say, the possibility of a delayed effect, which is common in immunotherapies, where the treatment takes some time before it becomes effective. So here we might be experiencing we might not experience the events as early as we initially thought, but again, we wouldn't want to overreact by taking action too early because it's literally like part of the treatment profile of the drug. And remember, this all relies on domain expertise, and it's going to involve a lot of communication between like the trialists, uh, the person involved in the logistics and maybe running the recruitment sites, between the sponsor, and even maybe between the regulator. So there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of very practical considerations to be made. So now what we're going to do is talk more specifically about two major prediction areas, enrollment, which is relevant for all trials, and then event milestones, which applies to a survival trial with a time to event endpoint. So beginning with enrollment, this is probably the most common prediction area you'll see in the context of a clinical trial. For example, you might want to know from the outset how long it'll take to enroll your full sample size. And then also like at interim timings, say halfway through the enrollment process, you might want to see if your trial is on track and if it's likely to finish at the planned time. If your trial is doing better than expected at an interim look, generally it's not an issue. Maybe in some extreme cases, you mightn't have the resources available to administer the treatment fast enough, but generally this isn't going to be a problem. Unfortunately, as I've said earlier, delays in recruitment are a much more common occurrence. This is especially true in early phase trials where it can be difficult to recruit healthy volunteers, but you also have similar problems at the confirmatory stage, especially if an established treatment already exists. But then I think the point is that at least if you can be aware that things aren't going as planned, you can hopefully like identify which areas or sites aren't performing well, and then hopefully be able to reallocate your resources. Or at the very least, it gives you enough information to open a dialogue with the trial sponsor. Some elements to consider are the multiple levels and multiple approaches to making these predictions. So sometimes the enrollment can be modeled or has to be modeled sometimes on a global level where everyone is assumed to follow the same accrual process. So this is it's a more simplified approach, but it can give you a reasonable estimate. But if you want to make more accurate predictions, then you'd be looking to model each recruitment site or maybe each region. So like the site could be a center or a hospital or something. We'd want to model these separately if the data is available. And then this extra knowledge obviously gives you more control, like the ability to add or drop new sites, or maybe like increase the enrollment cap in well-performing sites. And then certainly there are a lot of different approaches that you can make to the enrollment predictions. So these range from simple equations to statistical models and prediction intervals, simulations, and Bayesian approaches, which would use prior data and expectations. So I have more detail about these possible methods here on the next slide. So to start, for example, you'd have like you could use simple parametric models like linear or polynomial fits, piecewise parametric models where you'd be looking to identify change points. This is probably going to be a little bit more accurate, but what we're going to focus on today is modeling via simulation. Why simulation? Well, the main reason is because it's a more flexible approach. Like, it's very easy to make changes to your simulation model, and also it's easier to extract our prediction intervals where we can use methods like bootstrapping. The simulations, like I said earlier, can be done on a global level where there's one single event or one single accrual process, like a Poisson process. Or, like I said earlier, we can model each site separately if we have access to the site level data. So this will be a big focus of the demonstration later. But of course, there are other approaches such as machine learning, but we won't go into detail about these now. Moving on to events prediction, in many ways this is similar, but now we're focusing on an event such as death or disease progression. So these milestones, they're important to predict if you want to know when a survival trial will end, because here it's the event count that drives the power calculation. So in other words, we're interested in a time to an event. So if you recruited, let's say you could recruit a large enough sample size, but if for some reason you saw very few events in either group, then you won't be able to end the trial or make any inferences until you see enough events. But where this gets a bit more complicated is that you need to model the survival events process alongside other considerations. For example, if recruitment is still ongoing, then we still need to consider accrual milestones because without people in the trial, you can't have any events. And there could also be some other issues to consider too, such as like dropout, cure processes, or any other kind of competing process. Basically, anything that can lead to a subject not having the event of interest should be modeled so that we can have a more accurate idea of how many people are available to have our event at any given time. And then on top of this, just like we had different accrual models, the same goes for survival. So again, parametric modeling is an option for the events process, but it tends not to be very widely used for survival predictions. So like here we're talking about your standard exponential or Weibull model, or then there's also piecewise parametric modeling like the non-stationary Markov process, which this forms the basis of many survival sample size calculations. But again, the most common and a flexible approach would be simulation via a survival model like exponential, piecewise exponential, or log normal. That's what we're going to be focusing on today. So like if we use exponential, we'd be assuming a constant hazard rate. Piecewise exponential would be a bit more flexible. So you split the trial into a number of different sections, each with a different rate. And then there's also like the two-parameter Weibull model, where the probability of an event depends on how long you've been in the study so far. If you're not sure which model to go with, then you could fit multiple models and use like a classic metric like the AIC to determine which model is the best fit. But there are also some more like explicit algorithms that would dynamically allocate change points and then fit a piecewise exponential model for you. And then again, there are some other approaches you can take to event predictions, but I'm not going to focus on these today. Instead, and for pretty much the rest of the demonstration, I'm going to move on to an example of how we could make predictions via simulation. Okay, so here we have a survival trial that's ongoing, and this trial needs a total of 374 events to achieve its target power. And then at the current calendar time, which is 24.9 months, I believe, 50% of these events have occurred, and the time has come to conduct an interim analysis. They've calculated that the trial will need a total sample size of 460, and at the time of this interim analysis, 402 or 87% of these have been enrolled. And the patients are coming from a total of 127 sites, which are available to use for recruitment, but currently only 118 of these are open. So there's still an additional 9 sites available to open should we need them. Now, what we're going to do is use nQuery to make predictions via simulations about when the trial will end based on enrollment and events milestones. We'll examine the differences between using a global subject level enrollment process and a per site level enrollment process. We'll look at how unblinding the data would affect our predictions, and we'll also examine some different enrollment and survival models, like Weibull versus exponential, say, to see which is the most appropriate fit for this data. Okay, so I'm going to open nQuery, and for anyone not familiar with the software, this is the nQuery home screen. Normally, to open a sample size or power calculation, you'd click Create New Table, but today we're using the Predict feature. So you can either click the Create Prediction button here, or go Predict New Prediction from the toolbar. This will prompt you to import CSV files for the site or subject level data, if that's what you're going to want to use. Or in the case of if you only wanted to use summary data, then you could skip the import. But I've already imported the files, so I'll just open up the first prediction tab. So you can see that the layout of the prediction tool is slightly different to that of the sample size tables, but it does have some elements in common. For example, like on the right-hand side here, you have the same sort of help cards to guide you through each step. But now the left-hand column is called the workspace. This is where you'll be able to select the data that you've uploaded. Once we've started the prediction, we'll be able to view each step of the simulation so far. And then after the simulation is complete, we'll see that we'll be able to access the reports and the charts from here too. And then we have the main section in the middle here. This is where we're going to set up our simulation, which follows a sort of wizard-like process. And here's also where we'll be viewing the charts and the reports after selecting them from the workspace. Okay, so briefly, let's just look at the data sets that I've uploaded. So like I said, these were uploaded just as normal CSV files. Let's start with the subject level data. So here, each row corresponds to an individual subject. And I'll just go through what the columns mean now. We're not going to be too interested in the region today, but I think the options are EU, US, and Australia. Then there's the site ID, which tells us which site each subject came from. Next up is the arrival time. So what time did they arrive into the study? I think this is in months. And then the follow-up time, which is measured as the time that's elapsed since the subject arrived in the study. And then the meaning of this follow-up time, it depends on the value of the next column, which is called current. So if current is 0, then the subject hasn't had the event yet. So follow-up is just the amount of time the subject was in the study so far since arrival. If current equals 1, then the subject has had the event, and then follow-up is the amount of time the subject was in the study before having the event. And if this is -1, I think there's only a handful of those in this particular data set. -1 means that the subject has dropped out, so then follow-up will be interpreted as the amount of time the subject was in the study before dropping out. And then finally, we have the treatment column here. So 1 indicates the subject is assigned to the treatment group, and 0 being the control group. And notice, of course, that we'd only have access to the treatment column in the unblinded scenario, and we'd only have access to the site ID if we had access to site level data. So now let's also have one quick look at the site level data. So again, there's nothing too complicated here. Here, each row is going to correspond to a different site. So you see, we expected we have 127 of them, not all of which are currently open. SID is, again, the site ID, which can be used to link back to the subject level dataset. Each site has an enrollment cap, and if the site is already open for recruiting, then the open time will be here, along with the site's accrual rate. So this is the accrual rate seen so far in the site. And for unopened sites, say these two here, we don't have an open time, but what we do have are start and end times. So these are the earliest and latest times that the sites are available to be opened. Okay, so this is like the state of the trial so far, or like the current trial data. And now let's start looking at the prediction tool itself. So as we said, it's like a wizard-like process that'll take us through. And the first thing we need to do is select the type of prediction we want to make. So let's begin with a quite basic but sometimes realistic scenario. So we'll be dealing with blinded data. In other words, we don't know which group any individual came from. And to start, let's just look at subject level data only. And enrollment is still ongoing. So you can then either click the next button or the arrow here to move on to the next step. And then at any point, if you want to go back, then you can just select from the workspace. So our next step is to set up the subject level parameters. So first, let's assign the subject data CSV file. So as long as it's sensibly named, this should be fairly straightforward. Now our arrival time was the arrival column. We said that our status indicator was called current, and then you can see it's automatically assigned 1 to event, -1 to dropout, and 0 to censored. So in this case, this is correct, but if you were using a different notation in your data set, then you'd just have to edit it here. And then finally, we said that the time in the study was called follow-up. And remember, the definition of this depends on the value of the current column. So let's click next and move on. Because this prediction is for a survival trial, there are two main aspects we need to consider: the accrual and the event processes. We've said that recruitment is still ongoing, so let's first specify our accrual options. We can see here we already have 402 patients in the study. 212 are censored, so 212 are still available to have the event, where the remainder have either had the event or dropped out already. And we said that our target sample size is going to be 460. The default 804 here was just double the current sample size. So we're going to be recruiting an additional 58 people and simulating their arrival times. Then later we'll simulate the event times of these 58 along with the event times of the 212 that are currently censored. So it'll be 270 simulated event times. And just note, we're currently 24.9 months into the study. And then we have the option to decide if subjects are to be followed until the end of the study or for a fixed period after enrollment. Fixed periods would mean that all subjects are followed for the same amount of time, which might be nice from an analysis point of view, but let's just stick to the default here for now, at least for our first prediction. And because we're not considering site level data in this first example, we're going to be assuming a global accrual rate. The accrual model here is Poisson, so it's a Poisson process, and this estimated accrual rate is extracted from the data. Later, we'll look at what would change if we wanted to use a non-homogeneous or piecewise Poisson accrual process. But again, just initially, we'll stick to the defaults. Next up, we need to model the events process. So the target sample size you see is carried forward here from the previous step, but you could overwrite it if you wanted to. Like I said earlier, the milestone we're really targeting, though, is the 374 events, which is double the current number of events by default. And in this case, that's also what we're looking for. So as we said, like this is an interim analysis taking place halfway through the events process. By default, the events will be simulated using an exponential distribution with the hazard rate extracted from the event times that have occurred up to now. However, you could also make this piecewise exponential by adding more pieces, or you could use a Weibull model. But again, for now, let's just use exponential. And again, it's a global process as the data is blinded, so we're not specifying between the group 1 and group 2 hazard rates. So just to reiterate, this hazard rate is derived from the subject level data so far. So what nQuery has done, it's taken the follow-up times from every subject that has had the event. So that's their current status will be equal to 1, and then it's used these times to estimate this exponential hazard rate. Moving on to the dropout model, where we're just going to use a constant exponential model. You see here, currently there's only 3 dropouts. So for this study, dropout probably isn't going to have much of an impact. And you can see, as expected, the estimated dropout hazard rate is very low. And then finally, our last step are some simulation controls. So this could allow you to set the number of simulations, set a seed if you wanted to replicate the study, and you can also edit the percentile outputs here. Then on the right here, we can choose some additional output options. So I'm going to save the subject level data for every simulation just for demonstrative purposes. So next, click Run and let nQuery do the work. So this one shouldn't take too long. And now, as you can see, we have reports, plots, and tables ready to select from the workspace. So let's start by going into the simulation summary report. The left-hand side here details everything that went into the simulation, and the right-hand side gives a summary of the simulation outputs. So let's look at the summary. We can see that the average accrual duration was 28.5 months. So that's the time it's taken to recruit the total 460 subjects. On average, the full total was recruited in that time. Remember that the current calendar time was just under 25 months, so accrual went on for 3.5 more months on average. And then the average overall study duration was 43.48 months. The events target was reached in 100% of our simulations, and there was an average of 6 dropouts. So really, the only times when you wouldn't reach the events target in the vast majority of your simulations would be if the dropout rate was very high, or if you were using a fixed follow-up time that was too short to allow you to have the required number of events. And then you see below we have our percentile summary. So remember, these percentiles can be customized in the simulation controls, say like if you wanted the first or the 99th percentile or something. So the events and the sample size are the same in all cases. And then dropouts range from a 50th percentile of 3 to a 95th of 9. And the accrual duration ranges from like 27.8 to 29.3 months. The overall study duration ranging between 41.2 and just under 46 months when comparing the 5th and the 95th percentiles of our 10,000 simulations. So we also have some nice charts for the enrollment, the events, and the dropout predictions. So here for the enrollment, you can see what happened up to the time of the look, and then we have our prediction estimate and the 95% prediction interval for the process. In this case, I think the enrollment prediction does look a little bit strange. You can see that there is a little bit of a plateau just before the time that we took a look at the data, and our model seems to be assuming that this was just a blip and won't continue. We'll address this in a moment by looking at a non-homogeneous piecewise process and accrual process and what you could do if you had some kind of some additional knowledge about why the process was slowing down. We see a similar trend with the events prediction. So perhaps this suggests that we could consider a piecewise exponential or a Weibull event process. But to be honest, when you have like a little bit of a discontinuity here, every standard model will struggle with this to differing extents. So I guess you'd hope that once the trial is back on track, that this might end up being a reasonable projection. And then for this study, there's so few dropouts that there's not really much information to take from the dropout prediction plot. And then the data used to generate these plots is available in the enrollment, the events, and the dropout prediction tables. So it just gives you the same information in tabular form. And then two more tables to look at are the summary statistics per simulation. So there are 10,000 rows here, each giving summary statistics for every one of our 10,000 simulations. And for even more detail, there's the per simulation subject level data, where you can see the data for each individual subject in every particular simulation. So like the simulation number in column 1 and subject number in column 2. Looking at the survival or the event time and dropout columns, if there's only data in the event time column, then the subject already had the event and had dropped out by the time we began the prediction process. And those with 2 values are the ones that have been simulated. Okay, what I'm going to do next is rerun this simulation, but see if we can improve the handling of the accruals. So I'll just do the same setup quickly. You can see once it's done, once nQuery will speed up the process for you. Okay. So this time what we're going to do is increase the number of accrual periods to define a process that kind of reflects the stagnation that we witnessed in the last plot. So what we're going to do is take 5 periods to describe the process. So now this is becoming a non-homogeneous piecewise Poisson accrual model. So let's say at the current time of like 24.9, the accrual rate is about a quarter of the previous estimate. So we'll say it was 4. 1 month later, 25.9, it's improved, but gradually, so to 8. Another month later, 26.9, it's up to 12. And then 3 months later, at 27.9, the rate has recovered back up to the 16.1325. And then we'll just continue as normal with the rest of the simulation. And again, it won't take too long to run. I think immediately you can see that the enrollment prediction plot is looking a little bit more, this is looking like a little bit of a more realistic projection now. And taking a look at the simulation summary, the average accrual duration has increased to 30 months. So it's taking like another month and a half, but it hasn't had much of an impact on the average study duration. It's 43.8. So I think it's 43.8 up from, was it 43.48 or something. So the accrual is taking a little bit longer, but this is probably a more realistic projection. Okay, next what we're going to do is dig a little deeper and see what would be different if we had access to the site level data. So going back to the start, we're still dealing with blinded events, but this time we'll be using subject and site level data. So now we have two sets of variables to allocate to their two CSV files. The subject level data set will be almost identical, only now we have a site ID variable to link between the data sets. So this was SID. And because there's only two data sets uploaded, it automatically chooses the site level data for the allocation here. Everything here should be clear. So there's the ID, accrual rate, and the cap for all sites. The currently open sites use open time, and sites not yet opened are assigned a start and an end time. And just note that these unopened sites are completely optional, so they can be left blank if you want. Moving on to the accrual options. Again, our target sample size would be 460, just so we can make direct comparisons, and subjects followed until the end of the study. This time you'll see there's no global Poisson or piecewise Poisson accrual rate. Instead, we're going to be looking at the accrual info on a per site basis. So we can see the total number of sites is 127, 118 of which are currently opened. The unopened sites are at the bottom here. We could increase this total number of sites if we wanted to open more, or it can actually be decreased as low as 118 to remove the unopened sites. So they don't need to be used if you feel that recruitment is going well and that they're not required. You can't explicitly remove the sites that have already been opened, but setting the accrual rate to 0 would be effectively closing them. Looking at the table itself, you can see that we have accrual rate per site here, as opposed to a global accrual rate. So this has been taken from the site level data set. The enrollment cap is also taken from the site level data. And then we have this read-only planned accrual rate per site, which is just a read-only version of this column here. This exists just in case if you wanted to edit the accrual rate per site, you'll always have the original for reference. The site initiation time is when the site was opened. And then finally, there's the number of accruals, which is a count based on how many times each site ID occurs in the subject level data. So a count, so each time, how many times does 101 show up in the subject level data? It's important just to note that the implied accrual rate from what's happened so far, it can differ from the current number of accruals. For example, there are some open sites here. For example, we have some open sites that they've had 0 accruals so far, but the accrual rate of that site is non-zero. And then all of these rates and enrollment caps can be adjusted. So say if the trial isn't going to schedule and if resources allow, perhaps the enrollment cap of a well-performing site could be increased. And then for the unopened sites, we can adjust the times at which they can be opened. So if we wanted to open a new site immediately, we could set the start time equal to the start and end time both equal to the current calendar time. And then, yeah, So hopefully you're getting the idea of how having access to this site level data does give you more control over the recruitment process. After this, the rest of the setup is the same. We're assuming that the site doesn't have any effect on the event rate. Like if it did, it would be a much more complicated process to model. So again, we're going to stick to a target sample size of 460 for 374 events. For now, we'll go with the default one-piece exponential survival model to simulate the events process. But we could see it would be very easy to switch to Weibull if we wanted to use it. And again, the dropout information will be handled the same way as before. So we're back to the simulation controls. And this time we also have the option to save site-wise summary data and parameters. So one of these is to see what happened on average, and the other is to see what happened in each individual simulation for each site. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'll choose all available options, and we'll run the simulation. So because it's compiling more reports, this might take slightly longer to run, but it shouldn't take too long. And then once it's ready, what we're going to do is go straight back to the simulation summary. Okay. So the average sample size and events are still their target values of 460 and 374 respectively, but now the average accrual duration is just over 27 months, and the average study duration is 43.3 months. On average, there were 6 dropouts. The average follow-up time was 12.36, and all 127 sites were opened. Basically, these sites, they're given a random initiation time between the start and endpoints, and then in this case, they were all less than the total study duration for their simulation. Comparing this to the prediction that only used site level data, the average accrual period has now decreased by about 1.5 months, but it's only had a very minimal impact on the average study duration. So by using the individual accrual rates from each site, we can see that earlier, like the global process was being maybe a little bit pessimistic, because you would expect this one to be a more accurate simulation as we're using more data. Some other things you could do is see like how much time you would have saved if you opened more sites, and then sponsors could decide if it's worth the resources to make that happen. Also, you could have edited the accrual rates of certain sites in a negative manner to see how much longer the study will take if for some reason you get some slowdown in recruitment. The rest of this table is pretty much the same as before, only now you can see what happened also in each site on average. Here. And you can also see how each individual simulation went for each site. Okay. What we're going to do now is go one step further and see if things would be much different if the data we used was unblinded. So this information certainly won't always be available to everyone, but we do want to know just what impact would knowing which group each individual came from have on the predictions of the accrual and overall trial duration. So let's start another prediction, but this time choose unblinded events, again with site and subject level data. So the subject level data set now has one extra variable to assign, just a treatment ID. Again, 0 being control, 1 being treatment, and the site-specific data will stay the same. The accrual options will also stay the same. We'll keep targeting 460 subjects and keep all of the same accrual information per site. But now you see that the events are occurring through two separate processes for the treatment and the control groups. Let's initially stick to modeling both with the exponential distribution, just so we can make a direct comparison to the blinded case. And as expected, we see that the estimated hazard rate is higher in the control group, meaning that you'd expect more events to come from here. And the same goes for the dropout process. It's interesting actually that the dropout processes for the two groups are a little bit different. Maybe you'd have hoped that the group wouldn't have much of an effect on the likelihood of dropout. But again, let's just stick to the defaults to make a direct comparison. So let's run our simulations again and see what our predictions are. I'm not going to save all of the same charts now just to save time. We're just going to be looking at the plots and the simulation summary. Okay. So this time, the average accrual duration, it's almost identical, 27.06, which this is what you'd expect because the accruals are modeled in the same way. But now the total average study duration has increased it's increased up to 43.75 from 43.3 when we were using the blinded data. So unblinding the data, it hasn't had a huge effect, but it's still something, and suggested that when we blinded the data, we maybe slightly underestimated the total time to achieve the 374 events. One last change I'll make is to the events model, because we said earlier that maybe we weren't entirely happy with the projection using the exponential distribution. So if we switched to a more flexible Weibull distribution, we can see nQuery automatically estimates the shape and scale parameters for both groups. A shape parameter of 1 will be equivalent to exponential, and we can see that they're 0.85 and 0.81, which is quite close, but different enough to suggest that maybe this is a more appropriate model. So we'll keep everything else the same and just rerun the simulation. And this time we can see that the total study duration is increased to over 50 months. So clearly it's taking like the slowdown we saw close to the current time. The Weibull model is taking this into effect more so than the exponential model. And this is where knowledge and like domain expertise about the trial is going to come into use. So if you felt that the later trends were likely to continue, then you would say that perhaps the exponential model was being overly optimistic and that this flexible Weibull model is more appropriate. And again, if we look at the plot, we can see that just, by eye, this does look like a more reasonable projection. Okay, so we're almost out of time. So I'm going to leave the demonstration here and just briefly wrap up with some concluding remarks. So we've been looking at how delays in clinical trials are very common and how making predictions about when key milestones will occur is one of the best ways to monitor your progress and estimate when your trial will finish. Before we do this, you need to consider things like your target, what kind of model to use, what sort of information will be available, and how often you're going to carry out your prediction. The two areas we focused on today were enrollment prediction, where modeling at a site level can give you a much more informed picture. And then for survival trials, our milestones will be based around observing a number of events. So we meet to model both the survival and the enrollment processes. Okay, so I'll leave it there for today. If anyone would like to try a 14-day free trial of the full version of nQuery, which includes the expert tier prediction module, then just go to statsalts.com/trial, and all we will require is an email address. Also, if you have any further questions, either related to this webinar or just in general, then email info@statsalts.com and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. So, once again, thank you for your attention and goodbye.